Lately, in the anime and manga community, I've noticed a surge of people expressing the opinion that they believe manga reigns supreme over anime. In particular, the concept of one viewing anime as a superior medium perplexed one of the more prominent manga-based review channels on YouTube, leading them to curiously ask why. So with this video, I'll answer that question and argue for why I prefer anime over manga. First off, let me state that I think many people who perceive anime as a lesser art form than manga observe this subject through an obstructed modern lens, where they primarily see the medium from the narrow perspective that it solely consists of watered-down shonen manga adaptations, when in reality, anime extends far beyond those confines. Putting it this way, the practice of panel-for-panel perfectly translating the illustrations of a manga into animation is a relatively recent phenomenon in the overall history of anime. For instance, with the anime adaptations of the early works of Go Nagai, they almost completely diverge from their counterpart mangas, where they often follow similar premises, but other than that they pretty much go their own way. One such case includes the 1970s TV version of Devilman, which reworked its basis' framework into a superhero story more akin to, say, something like Ultraman, by exchanging a tragically brutal plot-driven narrative primarily centering around two characters for a more lighthearted story focusing on a community plagued by villain-of-the-week apparitions, which also placed a greater importance on creepiness and aesthetics. Or another animated example from Go Nagai's 70s repertoire would be Cutie Honey, which again followed the same premise and even objectives as its basis, but as its own series greater emphasized capturing the spirit of the late 60s, early 70s, thus providing this adaptation a more trendy, colorful, inherently nostalgia-inducing aura, all while portraying its cast in a cooler, more fashionable demeanor. From those examples, I acknowledge that some people may deem divergent adaptations as exclusive to the early years of anime, but that trend continued on long afterwards, such as with the mid-80s shonen classic Saint Seiya, whose anime adaptation took several artistic liberties in its conception, that by the way, go beyond just the inclusion of filler to prevent catching up to the manga, or censorship. Elaborating on that subject, you could say Saint Seiya's anime followed the plot points of the manga, but in reaching them, it took its own path. One such manner involved rewriting certain scenes to feature a different set of characters as its participants than from what its counterpart selected, which primarily occurred because the manga issued character polls asking its readers of their favorite cast member, resulting in Seiya, the main character, ranking beneath several of the side characters. So in response to that poll, the anime often integrated the more popular characters into a few Seiya-centric moments to please the fans. In addition to that, one of the reasons of why many disliked the manga's version of Seiya regarded the fact that at times he could act a bit childish. Well, the anime remodeled his personality so he behaved more mature and heroic. That quality alone already presents an argument for why one might view the anime as superior, as it rewrote debatably unpopular scenes in a more favorable light. Now, I don't wish to dwell too long on this subject, so I'll briefly list other key differences from the manga to the anime, like changing the mentor of a certain character, the omission of a double agent narrative, turning an open secret from the manga into a catch-you-off-guard revelation in the anime, altering a plot point of where a central antagonist impersonated a powerful figure by switching his target, or how both versions opened up differently, one starting with an exposition covering training session in front of Greek architecture, while the other, the anime, began in a dark alleyway with vicious-looking dogs eating straight out of the trash, only to zoom through a city and into a stadium, where a brutal clash of physical combat occurred. Moving on to the next example, Kinnikuman Nisei, or in the English language, more commonly referred to as Ultimate Muscle. To begin, the manga depicted more violent and lewd content, of which the production committee behind its adaptation would not allow in the finished product. But despite that setback, the anime refused to accept the status of a watered-down rendition, and instead invested in a more comedic approach. One method of this involved its characters, who participated in superpowered wrestling matches while in battle spitting out great innuendo-driven one-liners, which in my opinion I personally consider as the finest aspect across both versions of the story. Like one instance portrayed a combatant excessively stretching the wrestling ring's ropes, provoking a person in the audience to say, "That rope is about to snap like a G-string," followed by a brief pause, and continuing with, "on a guitar." Or another bit of dialogue featured the lead protagonist when about to fight his own father utter a comment that went along the lines of, "Late one night I saw Mom wrestle you into submission while she dressed up as Buffalo Man," which if you haven't picked up upon by now, implies he stumbled upon his parents fornicating. That humor alone already provides a reasonable excuse for why one might prefer the anime, as it possessed its own distinct charm not present in the manga. For the record, the comedic approach to the story never mocked or violated the essence of its source material, as jokes and all-around goofiness even pushed the comic itself forward. So the changes the anime made never turned the series into something it wasn't. Another topic concerning this story and its relation to its basis involves how it rewrote the outcome of an important battle. Basically, one version let the opponent win the fight, while the other had the protagonist take home the gold. Interjecting in this detail as well, Ultimate Muscle only adapted about a third of the Kinnikuman Nisei manga, and the previously mentioned change moment concluded the anime's run. Meaning for the viewers, this scene would be one of, if not the last moments of the series, so it had to end everything in a satisfying manner and leave as few loose ends as possible, which the televised version accomplished. Whereas since the manga could continue on past this point, it could leave stones unturned and wait for a later, potentially even better date to answer them. What I'm leading into is that if the anime perfectly replicated the structure of its source, it would have been a worse off fate, as doing so would have left off on a negative note that couldn't be followed up on. In other words, even if one might prefer the manga's iteration of the story, the animated version's deviation from a path it couldn't travel ultimately proved the wiser decision, which in and of itself earns it more credit than just the status of an inferior adaptation. Tying this all back to the main point, when I hear someone criticize the medium of anime for not perfectly adapting mangas, I oftentimes view this as a disingenuous argument, coming from a person seeking an entirely different product than what they comment on, as for the most part, the intention of anime isn't to flawlessly capture the essence or appearance of its source, but more so to present itself as its own independent story. In a certain sense, I somewhat view this idea as a person, group, or company just using a pre-existing story or cast of characters to tell their own new and unique version of an old story. In summation, because the vast majority of anime diverge from their mangas, for better or worse, that at least opens up the possibility of them surpassing their source. With all that said, now would be as good a time as any to state, I'm not going to lay out a blanket statement claiming anime always wins, and in every aspect too. In fact, from what I've mentioned thus far, I would say I prefer the animes of Cutie Honey and Saint Seiya, whereas with Devilman, I believe the manga wins, or at least against the 70s anime. And with Kinnikuman Nisei Ultimate Muscle, I would call it a 50-50 split between the two versions, as they both have their own unique strong suits. Like the anime introduced a certain character and arc earlier in the story, which add an interesting dynamic to the plot, via a third-party perspective, while the manga, on the other hand, allowed said person to smoke, establishing them as semi-corruptible and in a less than perfect image, in turn making them more complex, not necessarily better, than their animated counterpart. So with that said, I acknowledge that both art forms possess their own advantages, and that no clear-cut impeccable golden rule exists to firmly plant one as a superior medium. Transitioning into the next subject, I'll discuss why I disagree with one of the most widespread arguments in the conversation of anime versus manga, pertaining to how, in terms of graphic content and censorship, the comic format abides by less restrictive guidelines, allowing it to depict more violent or lewd material than its animated counterpart, hence the superior version. To respond to this, I'll reiterate the message of one of my opening lines, where I said most people who utter these types of statements only view anime as mere adaptations of long-running Shonen Jump series, rather than as their own entity, which as a perspective completely disregards the presence of OVAs, aka original video animations, a method of distributing the medium that played a major role, if not dominated the scene from the 80s till about the mid-2000s. Just so everyone understands the topic, OVAs released as direct-to-video products that bypassed the restrictions of television networks, and permitted this alternate type of anime to go absolutely wild with what they could show. On another note, in the more recent years, OVAs have taken on a new form as additional content exclusive to the home releases of televised anime, which is why across several franchises, you'll often notice episode 13s getting a bit more adult than the earlier ones, since they released independently. Back to the main point. Because OVAs possess the same creative freedom as manga, they could match the spiciness of their source, and on some occasions, even go beyond them by displaying even more extreme content. Such examples include Genocyber, Violence Jack, the 1980s version of Devilman, Angel Cop, and Getter Robo Armageddon. As evidence, I'll use the Devilman OVAs, where the anime altered a scene from the manga, featuring the titular antihero swiftly ripping the head off a demon, and instead adapting into him grabbing its skull and gruesomely crushing it. Or another instance involved randomly adding a filler fight against a Yannick-looking demon, resulting in it getting blown apart. Plus, when it comes down to it, watching something unfold in real time, especially with something damaging, leaves a greater impact than a couple of panels. To be fair, I should mention a criticism of OVAs, being that they frequently only adapt a fraction of a series' overall plot, or condense said story into a smaller work. In responding to that, with more established franchises like Devilman and Violence Jack, That definitely holds true, but with lesser known, more obscure series, the vast majority of OVAs, when they adapt a manga, they more so rewrote the work into its own separate version, i.e., not just a short and pale imitation. Again, I repeat, a new and different take on an old story at least leaves room for surpassing its source. As I've already extensively covered how series can differ between manga and anime, I won't regurgitate that for these current examples, but since both versions of Angel Cop deviate in a new way, I'll give that a mention. And it involved how these two iterations possessed entirely different art styles and character designs. Like the illustrations of the manga followed a softer, rounder 80s aesthetic, while the animes resembled a 90s style with a sharper, grittier attitude, so that even further solidifies them as separate entities, which the manga actually went out of its way to address. Similarly, Getter Robo Armageddon, which doesn't even really have a counterpart manga as it more so amalgamated several aspects of the overall franchise into one work, in story admits parallel worlds exist, implying itself to reside in its own separate universe. So it not telling the full story and doing its own thing worked to its benefit. Lastly, I should also acknowledge an elephant in the room regarding the criticism of OVAs not adapting the full story of a manga. And it's that most people watching the more extreme OVAs aren't exactly watching them for the story. I'm especially implicating Genocyber on this one. For instance, without a doubt the comic of Genocyber more coherently connects all of its various plot points together. In saying that though, if you read it, you'll quickly notice its story isn't its strong suit, and that instead sells itself on unsettling imagery, which is what the OVA invested most in. So in a certain sense, you could say the anime cut the filler and immediately went to what the audience wanted. On a similar note, the unregulated luxury of being able to portray whatever the creator desired, for the most part also applies to anime films as well, one such case being Golgo 13 The Professional. To lay out some context, its franchise's framework basically modeled itself off of the ever-popular 007 James Bond movie franchise, i.e. a man with a license to kill performing his duties, all while betting beautiful women, except Golgo 13, the manga, ramped those qualities up to a much higher degree. And let me say, that looks tame in comparison to Golgo 13, The Professional, its film counterpart, where almost every minute of its entire runtime consists of an artistic bloodbath or an atmospheric love scene. Switching gears, I want to talk about censorship on televised anime. But first off, I have to say, depending on what area you're watching, or even the series you view, this subject can take on a radically different form. To start off, I'll provide a comparison of censorship from an older anime versus a relatively modern case. With the older example, I'm picking the scene from Dragon Ball Z where Frieza accidentally cut himself in half with his own Destructo disc. Now, in the manga, after the bifurcation, a minimal amount of guts hung out of Frieza's severed torso, while in the anime, only blood oozed out of the wound. On to the more recent case, which occurred in One Piece, during a scene where Whitebeard charged Admiral Akainu. Now, in the manga, Akainu's lava-infused punch melted off half of Whitebeard's face, whereas in the anime, that same blow merely singed off a chunk of its target's signature mustache. Contrasting the differences between these two cases, Dragon Ball Z censorship only omits a minor detail, one that I personally never even noticed until someone pointed it out to me. And in spite of that alteration, the scene still chopped Frieza in half, so it resulted in the same outcome as the manga. One Piece, on the other hand, completely changed a moment's purpose. Like destroying half a face inflicts severe life-changing damage, while losing a mustache virtually means nothing in the end. So that censorship substantially lessened the scene's impact between versions. From these two examples, I have to say, they embody their own series and respective generations. Like the moments of censorship in the Dragon Ball Z anime occurred far and few between, and when they did, they slightly changed a minor detail that never altered the original intention of the scene. Whereas with One Piece, and its contemporaries for that matter, when they censored, they removed elements that drove the scene forward, and often rendered that moment utterly pointless in the overall scheme of the story. With that said, I want to compare the differences of censorship, or lack thereof, from the two eras again, but from a different angle, through how, let's just say, their willingness to show some skin. To begin, I'll start off with a censored character design from the Bleach anime, through the antagonist of Harabelle, who exposed something more than just her body by undressing. For context, she belonged to a unit known as the Espada, a powerful group of masked beings that bore numbered tattoos on their bodies, reflecting their strengths and status within the crew, which for Harabelle, hers happened to be located on the inside of her cleavage. Though in her earliest appearances, to withhold her rank, she hid this area behind a shoulder-length robe. Now, in the manga's version of the scene where she undressed and revealed her tattoo, the design of her mask partially obscured the top and front of her breast, which in the anime adaptation almost completely covered her chest region instead, leaving only a small opening to display her number. With this censorship, it essentially defeats the entire purpose of its scene, while also presenting itself in an unnatural, obviously altered manner noticeable even without prior knowledge. Symbolically with the original depiction, you could say she exposes some skin to unveil her true identity. But in the anime's diluted version, it loses its effect, as it removes a layer of clothing to show it resembles another layer of clothing, so it doesn't feel like the true self. Now, even though the censored portrayal still reveals a new aspect of her character by displaying her full mask, covering up the area around the focal point diminishes what little it retained. Plus, with the, I'll just say, under-support, it looks like an addition to the mask, rather than an innate part to it, so it lacks the natural flow of the design, thus making this inclusion all the more apparent as a kind of censorship. Continuing on to discussing this type of censorship in older anime. But first, I have to say, pre-mid-90s and earlier, the industry had almost no issues exhibiting unclothed characters, even on television and for a shonen demographic. For obvious reasons I can't include image proof, but I can list some influential series that did, such as the original Dragon Ball, Gundam Both 79 and Zeta, Ranma, Urusei Yatsura, and Fist of the North Star, which because of filler content, actually possessed additional scenes of this kind, not present in the manga. So censorship didn't really affect older anime in the same way as it would later go on to do with modern ones. Overall, these examples indicate how the argument of anime watering down manga isn't as widespread or destructive as one may be led to believe, and furthermore, much of this censorship pertains to just popular shonens of the past era, which even though they may contain some of the most iconic and well-known series, they don't reflect anime as a whole, as even in the more recent years, the medium released several over-the-top extreme shows like Akame ga Kill and Goblin Slayer, and on the other side of the debate, you get enticing series like Manyu Hikencho or High School DxD. With these two comparisons completed, I'll use what they established as a reason for why I prefer anime over manga. And putting it simply, what I view as anime, or the series that I'm fond of, remain relatively untouched by censors, and on the occasions that it occurred, it left little to no impact on the greater work. Or even sometimes the adaptation itself used a practice to its own advantage. That's the next topic. But first, I have to say, if one of your favorite series happens to be One Piece or Bleach, I can understand why you might favor manga. In fact, these cases would be one of the few times where I recommend the manga over the anime, though I might add for reasons more than just manga to anime censorship. In saying all that, even in their absolute finest, most unfiltered selves, I still don't view them as equal to Dragon Ball Z and its contemporaries. So a few, in my opinion, mid-tier series possessing superior mangas doesn't sway my overall view of the topic. And mentioning this too, with the DBZ era, I believe what their animes added to their respective franchises far outweigh the few minor losses they endured through censorship. Onto the subject of how some older series creatively and intelligently utilize technical censorship to their benefit. First off, a device often employed during intense anime fights involves, when a heavy blow lands, changing the color scheme of an on-screen image, which in its own way could be construed as a sort of censorship. But at the same time, that effect can easily produce a sense of immersion, or emphasize the importance of a moment. To prove this, I'll use an example from the Saint Seiya anime, where during a hallucination sequence, a decapitation occurred. Now in this scene, the color purple tinted the audience's view, also distorting the glow of the protagonist's normally red blood as well. At first glance, this may seem like watering the sequence down, as blood and the color red represent violence, so the altering of it may appear censorship. But as this moment progressed, the decapitated party, despite the injury, still continued moving as if nothing happened, which confused and terrified the person who inflicted the initial attack, opening him up to receive a blow in retaliation, thus ending the battle and causing the severed head to reappear with non-distorted colors. With this event, I say the purple censorship, if you want to call it that, brought out an extra dimension to the ambiance of the story. Like as all this occurred in a hallucination sequence, the decapitation technically never happened, or at least in the real world. So portraying this scene in unnatural colors subtly suggests something abnormal afoot. Next, the goal of this sequence never intended to appear as gruesome or violent, but instead as scary, and the purple aura inherently gives off a ghostly or creepy atmosphere, so the distorted color scheme produced the intended effects. On a side note, the anime adaptation still allowed red blood to go uncensored in other scenes, so in a certain sense, this censorship added a little variety to the show, as if every injury played out the same way, i.e. bled the same blood, it would become a little redundant over time. Just to give some evidence on the adaptation's willingness to go uncensored, the anime in a canon fight randomly decided to add an extra filler scene where a protagonist chopped off the arm of his opponent before the climax of the battle, which again never happened in the manga, so the anime made one scene more violent. Now yes, this is a rarity and it's more likely to go the other way around, but moments where the anime went more extreme than the manga do exist, even in non-OVAs too. Next up, another way in how an anime used censorship to its advantage, involving the battle between Ramen Man and Brocken Jr. in the Kinnikuman franchise. But first some context. Now, early on in the manga story, Ramen Man fought and killed Brocken Man, Junior's father, using the camel clutch technique to rip him in half. While in the toned-down anime, Ramen Man essentially noodled his opponent into a bowl of ramen. Believe it or not, this fight also subtly poked fun at its own censorship, by having a person on the sideline state, "I'm glad this brutal match wasn't televised." For reference, this basically occurred as an underground wrestling match, so this joke worked on multiple levels. In story, since its world literally didn't broadcast a fight, and as a fourth wall breaker, by indirectly commenting on how the anime altered the manga's original scene for television. Now, in the fight I'm using as an example, Ramen Man vs. Brocken Jr., Brocken Jr. attempted to avenge his father by performing the attack that brought him down on Ramen Man, the camel clutch, which forced the anime into an odd predicament, since they altered the original manner in how Senior died. But the adaptation turned this moment into a fourth wall breaking joke, where when the incident occurred, the manga following protagonist, Kinnikuman, commented, "That's the same technique that killed Brocken Sr., causing the anime's in-universe cast to humorously question and gaslight him during that exchange. So the anime turned this censorship, which it fully admitted it was, into an inside joke, and that meshes well with the comedy of the greater franchise, as it often references other media external of its own world. To conclude this section, I have to say, the people behind anime studios, especially those of the past, weren't fools, and even if they had to abide by certain restrictions that manga lacked, through their own artistic liberties, they could easily negate those negative effects and come up with something of equal or even potentially greater value to replace it. On to the next topic concerning censorship. Now, one significant criticism of anime involved how dubs or external releases outside of Japan often altered the original version domestically. A few good examples of this would be recoloring Blood to Sweat, omitting references to alcohol, smoking, or religion, and otherwise adult content in general. And for that reason, I've heard numerous people call manga better, as they erroneously believe it possesses an immunity to that. Well, to that I have to say, if you see that as a knock against anime, then you also have to criticize manga as well, as it too fell victim to censor-happy releases outside of Japan. And for evidence, I'll use the Viz release of the manga Eyes. For context, one infamous panel in its story featured the protagonist's love interest's face photoshopped onto the body of an unclothed model, which in the censored English version covered her breast with stars, as opposed to the original comic that let everything remain out in the open. So this example highlights how licensors of Japanese media censored things besides anime. In mentioning this too, the OVA release of Eyes featured this same scene uncensored, meaning that between both versions, if you live in the United States, the anime would have been the less watered-down experience. A similar instance to this also occurred in the manga Parasite, where in its story, an alien parasite infected the protagonist's hand, and after learning of human anatomy, assumed a phallic shape. Now, in the English release of the series, its licensor redrew this panel so the parasite took the form of a snake. Again, the anime adaptation of this work, Parasite the Maxim, depicted this moment more accurately than the Western release of the manga. To be fair, the anime also slightly altered this scene, by moving the phallus away from the focal point and into the corner, but still, it better retained the original message. To get through this a little quicker, I'll name an example of censorship in anime, and follow up with a similar case from manga. First off, the 4Kids dub of One Piece made Sanji smoke a lollipop. Well, the Naruto manga erased a cigarette right out of Shikamaru's hand. Next, early 2000s anime often removed or covered up religious iconography in its American releases. Like a Yu-Gi-Oh card known as Monster Rebirth converted an ankh into a sword. Again, manga incurred the censor's wrath too. Like the English version of Shaman King pulled an effigy of Jesus off of a cross-shaped tombstone. And similarly, the comic of Full Metal Alchemist crucified the character of Greed on a round rock, changing it from the original's cross. Finally, the Deke rendition of Sailor Moon during a bathing scene raised a tub's water level to make its protagonist appear as flat-chested. Now, how manga accomplished a similar feat involved drawing undershirts beneath the open-neck clothing of busty ladies to hide their cleavage. One such case involved Rangiku from Bleach. With all that said, in the West, if you wanted to escape the censors of the 4Kids treatment, you couldn't exactly run off to manga, as oftentimes, it too suffered the same fate as its animated counterpart. On that note, even in Japan, manga abides by some restrictions and censorship. Like, not even it can permit showing, I'll say, what's in between the legs. Like, Fist of the North Star got away with blowing up heads, but not even it could portray a man standing freely without any clothes on, as when it occurred in Chapter 4, the series had to go full-on Hokuto no Ken doll and blank out this character's groin. So yeah, manga may not be as strict as anime, but it still has its own limitations too. To conclude this section, the argument of censorship giving manga the edge over anime comes off as a bit of an exaggeration, as the practice itself, for the most part, really only carries any weight with the more recent series or popular ones of the last generation, which constitutes a fraction of the medium as a whole. And in saying this too, this debate often relies on making mountains out of molehills from rather insignificant details in the long run. Lastly, this subject largely ignores that manga falls victim to the censors as well. So to this argument, an equivalent exists. From that line, I'll pivot to the next topic and engage in whataboutisms, by proving how many of the recurring complaints used against anime often apply to manga in some way or another too. To begin, one of the most commonly uttered criticisms of the medium involves how many series end abruptly. Two such manners include, how come blank never got renewed for a third season, / didn't adapt the full story, or this series rushed to conclusion, i.e. smush what should have been several episodes into one. Getting straight to the point, abrupt endings actually plague manga far more often than anime. For starters, due to a lower production cost, the industry produces significantly more new manga series a year than anime, so on numbers alone, that already makes the former more susceptible to premature endings. But besides that, another obstacle forces many mangas to finish their runs early, stemming from limited space and a greater number of competitors. Let me put it like this. The prominent entries of the medium typically release through periodical magazines, who at a time can really only publish around 10 series. So if one underperforms or fails to show a sustainable future, the backing company at a moment's notice won't hesitate at canceling something seen as wasting space, especially if they believe they might harbor potentially more successful upcoming series they need room for. And mentioning this too, quite a number of mangas never even reached a full year mark. From Weekly Shonen Jump, 5 out of the 12 series that began in 2021 alone have already been canned. On top of that too, the magazine in under a year also discontinued both Masashi Kishimoto, the author of Naruto's new work Samurai 8, as well as Build King from Mitsutoshi Shimabukuro of Toriko and Sekimatsu leader Den Takashi fame. So not even prolific authors of the last generation receive a protection from cancellation. On the other side of the spectrum, even successful long-running manga series have suffered from abrupt endings. Like Shueisha forced Toriko and Bleach to rush through their final story arcs, skipping out or only briefly glossing over long built-up events. Health concerns also forced Yoshihiro Tagashi to speed through the last chunks of Yu Yu Hakusho, and some mangas remained unfinished because their creators died during its production. With that said, I want to mention this. Of the 2010s generation, one of the most requested Season 2s of an anime would have been High School of the Dead, whose manga, if you didn't know, also ended incomplete, as its illustrator went on to work on his own series because its writer fell ill, which put the series on an indefinite hiatus. And before the pair could work together again, the author passed away. And because of that, both the publishers and the man who drew the comic felt it better to just drop the manga entirely rather than continue it. So one of the biggest criticisms for anime ending too early, or at least from a certain era, occurred because the counterpart manga never continued / completed either. Overall, just as with anime, manga too suffers from premature endings. Except since the medium may not be as spotlighted as its counterpart, especially in the department of lesser-known series, it often goes unnoticed. In mentioning this too, this entire argument relies on the premise that premature / abrupt anime endings never work, which in all honesty may be more often true than false, but several series succeeded at it, like with the 2011 anime adaptation of Hunter x Hunter, whose finale ended with the conclusion of a significant arc, resolved every necessary issue, and the unanswered questions only revealed surface-level elements, so not knowing their full background didn't leave loose ends. Plus, that actually ties into the overall theme of the story, that there's always more to be discovered. So the series' abrupt ending satisfied on every front, whereas the manga continued on past that point, and introduced numerous intriguing aspects that'll take decades that the author might not even have to resolve. So the early conclusion, in the long run, probably saved this series by cutting it off at the right time. To me, this also applies to the Berserk franchise. Now, most of you already probably know this by now, but for those who don't, its author, Kentaro Miura, died while writing this 30-plus year manga, so it too left many necessary questions unanswered, whereas its 1997 anime completed its story in such a way that it accomplished everything it set out to do. To summarize it in the briefest of manners, its plot opened up in a chaotic world, and its narrative went back in time to show how the world became chaotic, so its story went full circle, whereas the manga continued on past that point, and you could say it set out on a quest to return the world to normalcy, which of course went unfinished because of the author's untimely passing. So, from these two franchises, I can't write off abrupt endings, as arguably their animes left on more satisfying notes. The next topic of whataboutisms in anime versus manga pertains to what I'll call the cleanup. To begin, one criticism of anime that popped up quite often a few years back involved how, due to time constraints, many televised series put little to no effort into the individual frames of animation, which would later have to be corrected in the Blu-ray release of said work. The most commonly cited case of this would be Dragon Ball Super, and from that sprang an infamous reputation for releasing art-wise, low-quality content, perceived as below the standards of its manga counterpart, and has led many to view this as a trick to coerce fans into buying more merchandise. As you can all guess by now, I have an equivalent example for manga too. For those of you who may not understand the industry, manga has primarily two distribution styles: anthology, a la periodic chapter releases, which every set number of days sells the newest issues of a series, alongside other franchises, and volumes, aka the tankobon, which compiles several previously released chapters from a single series into an organized collection. How this mimics the television to Blu-ray structure of anime regards the fact that periodic chapter releases follow tight schedules and abide by strict deadlines, forcing the series artist to work at a rapid, leaving much room for error pace. Now because of this, the later release volumes, besides compiling older chapters, also serves as a means to improve the quality of artwork and fix any past mistakes. Usually these corrections only consist of minor inconsistencies, something like forgetting to draw a temporary injury from last week's chapter in the current issue. But because the option of cleaning up everything later in the volume release exists, sometimes authors, especially if they might be ill, put minimal effort into the periodic version. A few prominent examples of this include Chapter 150 of Jujutsu Kaisen, the cultural festival arc of My Hero Academia, and much of Hunter x Hunter, which from my perspective are personally, in terms of art quality, rank below the animation of the early episodes of Dragon Ball Super. With all that said, manga can also suffer from less than stellar first releases that one might construe as a practice to ship extra merchandise. And from my own view, I have to add that manga fans are more likely to first experience this series through the enhanced volume edition, whereas with anime, most people only see the televised airing. Like, streaming services generally don't upload better versions, while manga websites on the other hand usually do, since it takes up less bandwidth. So I think from the perspective of a manga fan, this practice may go unnoticed more often. As this last topic focused on artwork, I thought now would be a good point to transition into the subject of what looks better, anime or manga. First off though, I need to say, in general, beauty lies within the eye of the beholder, so much of this argument should be seen as subjective. To begin, the sentence, "the manga looks better," has always served as the automatic go-to point for people in the camp of manga over anime. In saying that though, there's more than meets the eye in this debate, as other factors, though what I would call who, what, and when, play significant roles in this discussion also. For instance, in the who department, I return to the artist Yoshihiro Togashi, a person with whom I've always preferred the anime adaptations of his work to his own, as throughout his career, he suffered back problems, causing him to adopt a minimalist approach to manga. Examples include substituting illustrations for excessively long drawn-out text boxes, often resorting to backgrounds of pure white in favor of actual environments, and drawing characters in a lofty, almost cloud-like manner. In some cases, I believe this style can work to his advantage. Like during a heart-to-heart conversation between two boys in Hunter x Hunter, the use of white backgrounds almost creates an illusion that they separated from the rest of the world, which under the context of the scene meshes well, but in most circumstances, I believe this hinders his art. With Yu Yu Hakusho, for instance, in a sequence where a gritty teenage delinquent encountered his sickly ancestor, the minimal use of details and a white backdrop turned this serious scene into more of an aloof moment than it should have been, and pretty much most of Togashi's work relates more to the context of this scene, which is why I favor the look of his anime adaptations over his own material. In addition to that, his art style presents several intimidating characters as having a bit of a baby face, which severely lessens the mood, whereas the animes of his work chisel those same designs out of stone, thus better fulfilling the look of the parts they play. For the record, Togashi sometimes went into greater detail with his illustrations, but seeing the difference in appearances makes me support this claim all the more, as the styles seem inconsistent in the long run. Another example of me preferring the look of the anime over the artist's own style would be with Masami Kurumada of Ring ni Kakuro, Fumino Kojiro, and Saint Seiya fame, as let's just say his artwork follows an impressionistic, almost effeminate shoujo-esque style, which contrasts the rough nature of his battle shonen stories, whereas the anime renditions of his series applied a hardened 80s aesthetic to their appearances. Also, Kurumada's stories often deal in spiritual or ethereal aspects that manga can't easily pick up on all that well, whereas anime and its extra assets effortlessly capture their essence. Overall, I use the word who as a factor for saying anime can look better, because the condition or nature of the person behind the pen sways the visuals of their work. Onto the factor of what. Now, I use that term because the visual quality of anime varies between their methods of release. I say that since I think most people debating this subject only take into consideration televised anime and not the full spectrum, which includes OVAs and movies. Like strict deadlines and a high workload can hamper a televised anime in comparison to manga, whereas the freer OVAs can take a year and a half to produce 6 30-minute long episodes if they so desired, meaning they adhered to less restrictions time-wise than most manga, thus allowing them to go all out in its creation. Like here's a comparison of the 90s Blackjack OVAs versus its manga. For the record, despite their similarities in positioning, these images originate from different scenes. I just thought I should mention this. But from what you can see, the anime's visuals clearly obliterate the manga's. The adaptation looking better than its source holds true for another Osamu Tezuka series in Astro Boy, where in terms of appearance, its 2003 anime stands as the absolute pinnacle of the franchise, with its near cinematic level quality of drawings and animation. For instance, compare the designs of the character Pluto from the original manga versus this rendition, where he went from a beetle-like robot to a militaristic mecha with all the nuts and bolts of his construction visible. So this version actually redrew a design in a more detailed fashion than its basis. A manga equivalent to the 2003 Astro Boy animated series exists, but it released after the anime, in contrast to the normal manga spawning an anime pattern. Again, this is subjective, but in my opinion, the animated series still beats out the 2003 comic version. One of the major reasons for why the 2003 anime went all out in the quality department regards the fact that as a work, it celebrated the 40th anniversary of this series, so its outstanding appearance honored the history of the franchise, and that also serves as a rationale for why I said the term when can affect the visuals, as sometimes for celebration/anniversaries, the studio creating said work goes full force in its production. Returning to OVAs, much of what I said for Osamu Tezuka holds true for the works of Go Nagai as well. Like in my opinion, the OVAs of Devilman visually far surpassed the original material, especially since it animated the more over-the-top scenes that require motion. Likewise, the anime Cutie Honey universe celebrated Go Nagai's 50th anniversary as a manga author, by more closely adapting the source material into animated format. Now, in the art department, it may not reach the level of Astro Boy 2003, but one can definitely argue that it wins against its basis. From these two authors and their later adapted works, I conclude that frequently, relatively modern anime adaptations usually beat out their several decades-old mangas in the end. So that's another aspect to add to the win category. And continuing on to that subsection, an observation of mine involves how, depending on the point of where an artist may be in their career, can influence this discussion also. Like, I won't call this a constant, but I have noticed this occur occasionally, where an author's earlier series look less remarkable than their anime adaptations. Then as time goes on, their later projects slowly overtake their animated counterparts. For instance, one occurrence of this would be with the writer-illustrator duo Yuta Tamago and their franchise Kinnikuman, where in their first entry, also known as Kinnikuman, their artwork, particularly among human-shaped bodies, appears bulbous, stubby, and feature heavy outlines, while the series' anime counterpart drew the exact same characters and figures, but with more realistic proportions and minimal outlines, thus making it easier on the eyes. Now, even though the manga technically included extra details in its panels, the anime ultimately looked better, with its more solid understanding of shapes and physiques. In saying that though, in the sequel story, Ultimate Muscle, in this aspect the manga generally beat out the anime, as by this point their designs assumed a more natural look, and when coupled with the even more intricate than its predecessor's extra details, it took on a stabler form, that its counterpart could rarely ever stack up with. So I say the term win should be taken into account when comparing anime versus manga visually, because a manga artist's style and technique can improve and evolve over time, meaning the skills of a rookie illustrator can rank below those of an animation team. By the way, Yuta Tamago's ages were 19 and 20 when Kinnikuman first serialized. But once they progress and become veterans, their material can become too advanced for an animator to perfectly capture. On another note, I see this pattern as true in a different sense, through long-running series. Again, the premise of the manga artist improving over time stays the same, but anime follows a slightly altered trajectory, where its picture quality starts off as high and gradually declines as the years go by. One reason for this pertains to the fact that prior to a series release, the studio behind said production possesses more prep time to perfect everything. But if a story continues on for too long and catches up to its source material, they lose that planning period and have to crunch to keep the pace up, resulting in the quality dipping. I view this as especially true for the 20-year plus and still ongoing One Piece, as some of its earliest episodes visually stack up to its manga, but ones released a decade plus later look far worse than their chapter equivalents and even against its old glory days too. Again, this trend recurs, but can't be called a constant. Like, the One Piece anime will occasionally go the extra mile in adapting a more serious or important moment, and even for certain arcs too. But I just thought this trend deserves a mention, since it provides a wider view of the anime versus manga debate. On to the flip side, I do have to remind everyone that the illustration quality of a manga over time can also deteriorate, while its anime maintains its appearance, like with the previously mentioned Yu Yu Hakusho and its ailing author. When comparing the visuals of anime and manga, a subject I rarely see mentioned involves how anime often redesigns characters, especially through their color schemes, to make them more pleasing on the eyes. And this topic stands as one of the reasons for why I say anime can look better than the manga, or at least against volume covers, since most individual pages never get colorized. For instance, a trend of 70s and 80s shonen featured the lead protagonist with an all-white color scheme, usually to denote a pure-of-heart mentality. Two such cases include Kinnikuman from Kinnikuman and Seiya from Saint Seiya. Now, in both of their anime adaptations, they received new color schemes that employed heavy use of the color red, which represents traits like hot-bloodedness and passion, while also coming off as more leaderly, especially in terms of younger characters. So thematically, their redesigns better embody their respective characters' natures than their old color schemes. But besides that, to me, the strict use of only white comes off as a bit bland, whereas their redesigns make them appear more interesting. Like Seiya also sports silver armor, which shines brighter next to red than white. And with Kinnikuman, I'm going a bit more in depth, but in the story, he shares a friendly rivalry with the character of Robin Mask, who in the manga possesses a whitish-silver color scheme, while in the anime, he has bluish skin, or at least when wearing his trademark armor. What I'm getting at is, red and blue innately clash, meaning the anime better emphasizes the contrast between them, so as a color, I believe red better interacts with other shades than white does. For both of these franchises, the anime improving the design/color schemes of characters went beyond just the leads, but also in its other characters as well, like with Saint Seiya's Ikki, who wears the Phoenix armor, which in the manga consists of only the color orange. But the anime turned multicolored by adding blue, silver, red, and pink into the mix, or with Athena, who in the manga sports simple brown hair, which the anime dyed into a regal, almost otherworldly purple. So in my personal opinion, I believe the anime made these two characters more visually appealing and increased their uniqueness from the rest of the cast. With the Kinnikuman franchise, I'll speak a bit more broadly. Now, this series features superpowered beings from other worlds duking it out in the wrestling ring, but in the manga, much of its cast consists of characters with of-this-world flesh tones with relatively normal-looking color schemes, making many of these characters seem like normal people wearing costumes. Whereas the anime in its redesigns bolstered the believability that these wrestlers weren't just humans in costumes, but in fact, out-of-this-world super beings. Real quick, I want to mention a similarity between instances from when I prefer a black and white manga to a colorized anime, and how that supports my claim of redesigns improving an original image. First off, this often links to an artist with a great eye for black and white aesthetics. And with that, I'll go to One Piece's creator Eiichiro Oda, who in a color spread for this series, canonically depicted the characters of Queen and Black Maria as sharing the same blonde hair color, which for the record their anime counterparts also possess, but in the black and white manga, Oda inked in Queen's hair, to make it appear as a darker shade, while with Black Maria's he left hers uncolored, meaning that Oda broke the color coordination of the story, since because canonically they harbor the same shade of blonde hair, in the manga their ink work should technically match, but it doesn't. In saying that though, if Queen's manga hairstyle remained uncolored, I personally would have found it less visually pleasing than his anime's variant. Again, Oda's own chosen colors. So because the black and white One Piece rejected color coordination and did what was best for its own medium, it ultimately came out the more picturesque version. And with that said, I believe this same idea applies to anime, as simply following the style of its canon isn't always what's best for itself. But when it makes its own alterations, such as changing color schemes, it has the potentiality to be its own version. So that's why I think anime redesigns can appear as better looking than its manga. One thing I should also mention regards the fact that certain genres simply look better in animation, such as science fiction. Like, it's hard to create an immersive cyberpunk world with colorless frozen panels, no matter how well drawn or detailed it may be, whereas anime absolutely excelled in this area, like with the 80s OVA titans, such as Megazone 23, Bubblegum Crisis, or Cyber City 080808, none of which originated as manga. Like, something as minor as a neon light piercing through darkness instantly draws you into its world, or seeing the synchronized movement of an in-motion machine almost carries a visual poetry to it. Besides cyberpunk, anime brought new dimensions to space operas. Like, following a fighter jet as it traverses and dodges the innards of a massive space station wouldn't be the same if it stood locked in a stationary panel. Or a galactic space battle between planetary-sized ships might seem underwhelming without hundreds of on-screen flickering lasers. Overall, simply claiming that manga looks better than anime ignores many nuances of this debate, like how a televised version of a series can appear subpar next to a home release. So comparing a newly aired anime episode to an updated chapter of a manga volume wouldn't be a fair equivalent. And this argument also pretends that both mediums consistently retain the same quality, turning the blind eye to how factors like the status of the creator, methods of release, or where in the overall timeline of the story this might occur can affect the quality of the product. So when it comes down to it, this topic even has to analyze every scene on a case-by-case basis for true accuracy. Lastly, I know this may run contrary to this past section, but when it comes down to it, visuals alone don't equate a quality product. In all honesty, what I personally consider as the best fight in all of anime aired in a 1971 episode of Tiger Mask, which if judged on visuals alone, would face ridicule to no end, as its illustrations resemble rough sketches, and its animation often looks jerky. But besides that, with everything else, this battle flat out excelled. Like, this match depicted two people brutally going at it for almost 15 straight minutes, and it never sugarcoated anything, as behind every blow, you could feel its impact in your bones. Like, at one point, you see a guy take a metal chair to the knee. That scene also played around with the sound effects too. Not only were the moves that landed impactful, but also the ones that didn't, as this battle contains some of the most suspenseful, nail-biting narrow dodges of any anime. In addition to that, this fight displayed incredible choreography, with every action feeling unique, and it followed up masterfully with the reactions too. For instance, at one point a character gets slammed headfirst into a ring post and promptly falls out of the arena, only to take a knee to the chest from his opponent. Then as he crawled away, he received a pummeling from a table, causing him to in retaliation kick it in half, only to be stabbed by the sharpened edge in response. And that was all one relatively quick sequence too. This brawl also took full advantage of the physics and of the surrounding area too. Like, a fighter used a telephone wire to choke his opponent, and at one point, when he got ripped in half, he used it to electrocute his opponent. Briefly interjecting this in, both anime and manga often use electricity in combat, which its usage in anime comes off as more natural, hence the superior, since the medium uses multiple frames per second instead of a one-time panel, allowing it to add more immersive elements into its incorporation, such as inverting colors or flickering effects, which Tiger Mask did as well, whereas with manga, electrocution techniques mostly come off as just jagged outlines. Back to the topic at hand, where the strangled man briefly escaped his foe's clutches by an over-the-shoulder throw, only for the still around his neck wire to pull him down also. So this fight used the same object in multiple different ways, and applied physics to it. With that said, I think I've made my point. And from that, I have to say, Tiger Mask stands at the top, not for its looks, but for its content. So for my own arbitrary opinion, I have to say, people who call manga better than anime solely on visuals only focus on one lone aspect, that may not even hold as much importance to the latter as the former. Like, as manga consists of one single stationary panel, a bad illustration can weigh heavily on it, as it sits in the limelight, whereas with anime and its in-motion multiple frames per scene, a poorly drawn or less detailed image won't be as noticeable or catastrophic to it as a medium. Meaning, disliking anime for not having as high quality artwork would be no different than hating manga for not having animation. On to the next reason of why I prefer anime, which regards the fact that as a medium, it can better set the tone and capture ambiance in ways that manga simply can't. I go to the anime adaptation of Buso Rinkin for reference, where in a filler scene, the family and friends of a major character learned of his death. What made this moment special wasn't necessarily the event itself, but how it presented its revelation, where in this scene, the audience's view stood outside a building, but peered in through a window to observe an inaudible messenger conversing with the family and friends of the departed character. And after a while, several of them expressed shock, one even collapsing to the floor. So, without even uttering dialogue, the series created an emotional moment to an event we already knew transpired. First off, let me state that bodily reactions to an event can often resonate on an emotional level deeper than one's based purely on language, whether it be vocal or especially text. Next, as a medium, animation has elements it can sever itself from and still function properly, which in doing so can bring out a totally unique effect. Whereas manga, on the other hand, can't, or at least without an unnatural feeling. Like, erasing a text bubble from a manga removes any indication of a conversation, whereas since anime has motion, it can emit sounds or voices and still present characters as communicating, as long as, say, something like their lips flap. Going off on a brief tangent, these inclusions, or maybe more aptly put, exclusions, greater emphasize the severity of the moment. Like during a scene where a character sustains a heavy blow, removing the noise of the impact or even an injured shriek, to a certain extent, almost amplifies the power of the attack, making it more potent in the process, as it refocuses everyone's attention to one single element. And I believe that same concept applies to the revelation of Busou Renkin as well. So that's why I say the anime resonated on a deeper emotional level. Next, on illustrations alone, manga can't replicate the effects of this scene without changing its context or leaving the impression that it skipped over something. Like if in one panel it showed a group looking normal, then the next it displayed them upset, it would seem like an image in between got jumped over, rather than coming off as an omission for artistic purposes. Alternatively, an attempt of this in manga without text could accidentally send a wrong message, and have the readers misinterpret the characters as communicating through facial expressions instead of vocally, so it could also spark confusion on that part too. What I'm getting at is, anime can craft scenes that manga can't replicate, which oftentimes happen to be some of the most emotional, complex, or interesting moments in an entire series. With the next subject, manga can produce its effects, but anime can take it to the next level, which involves using the environment or weather as an ambiance to convey the tone. Now, obviously in a manga panel, an artist can illustrate something like lightning or raindrops, but resting in a motionless panel, it can't harness the full extent of the environment. Let me put it like this. Storms, because of their wild and uncontrollable natures, inherently evoke sensations of chaos or turmoil, but the stillness of manga counteracts this. In all fairness, complex imagery can semi-remedy this, but not fully negate. Whereas animation can bring out its maximum effect. The constant downpour of rain, the disappearing and reappearing lightning that can briefly change a scene's colors or make everything go temporarily dark, the swirling gusts of wind blowing debris away. Even consider what these do to the environment, such as destroying glass or causing lights to flicker. For instance, one of my favorite scenes from the Dragon Ball franchise features a dejected post-Lost to Android 18 Vegeta standing atop a cliff during a rainstorm, pondering his own existence. And once he regained his composure, he powered up, which split the sky, thus ending the storm. So the weather in this scene reflected Vegeta's inner strife, and its dissipation meant reaching a state of clarity. In contrast, the manga's version of the same moment had him just destroy the surrounding area, with no additional weather effects. From that, I also have to say, the anime expressed far greater range than the manga, something contemplative, dare I even say transcendent, whereas the manga basically resorted to just rage. On a side note, during the animated rendition of this scene, Android 18's voice haunted Vegeta's thoughts, many lines overlapping one another, which further exemplifies his lost in thought mental state. And from that I have to say, anime can better deal with subjects of the mind. Again, manga can semi-capture this aspect, but to nowhere near as high a level. An example being writing several texts around an illustration to indicate voices overwhelming a character. Now this accurately depicts what occurred, but it lacks the immersion. Like overlapping audio can become incomprehensible and hard to distinguish, so you the viewer experience what the character feels. Whereas with text, you can read all the lines separately at your own pace one after the other, so it cannot achieve the same effect as anime can. Getting back to atmosphere and ambiance, because anime uses color, that adds an extra layer of identity to the locations of a series. Like in Dragon Ball Z, the green skies of Namek produce an abnormal alien aesthetic to the world, thus differentiating the Frieza saga from the normal blue-skied Earthlock Cell saga. Whereas in the mostly colorless manga, unless a Namekian-styled building or tree lurks in the background, the area won't look too radically different from any other environment. This idea applies not only to other worlds, but everyday life as well. Like manga generally resorts to simple white backdrops for panels, and occasionally colors it in black to indicate night, which from those two options provides the medium little to no atmospheric range, or even something as simple as the ability to even tell the time of day. For instance, when manga uses the color of black to connote it's dark out, all it can really say is it's dark out, whereas anime can mix in a little navy blue to make it seem like it's a cold night out, or adding in some purple implies something sinister afoot. So the additional colors of anime vastly increase its atmospheric range. On that note, even if a white backdrop represents daytime, that still can't differentiate between morning, noon, or sunset, unless a panel specifically includes the position of the sun. And something as simple as the period of the day can easily enhance a scene, through its own inherent ambiance. Like the orange glow of sunset, or the end of the day, almost innately carries a sadness to it, which could bolster the impact of two characters parting, either through a farewell or a death. Likewise, the softer colors of morning possess a tranquil or peaceful tone, while the intense brightness of noon mesh well in a scene where someone or thing finds life bearing down on them. So again, anime's additional colors build new visual roads that only it can venture. Likewise, removing this extra dimension yields positive results too, as regressing the medium back to black and white functions as a good way to highlight a lifeless or dire situation, and also serves as an excellent method of initiating a flashback sequence, which happens to be the next area of discussion. Now, in both anime and manga, especially with long-running series or shonens, their stories often recall past events, usually to showcase how far a character has come. Now, I've always seen this as a field where anime excelled, but manga struggled. Let me put it like this. Besides the luxury of being able to change the tint of a picture, the image contours of a frame of anime follow the exact same size and shape as past episodes, unless it fell under the rare exception of airing through the transition into widescreen. But again, that's an uncommon occurrence. Meaning an old clip of anime can easily find itself inserted into a new montage and correctly follow the flow. Whereas with manga, as most panels consist of unique shapes and sizes, they can't all fit together properly on a new page, and because of that, when many series attempt this practice, they often resort to just scaling down previously drawn illustrations and pasting them above the speaking character's head in a newly drawn panel, which for me breaks the immersion. The other major reason of why flashbacks work better in anime regards the fact that a single episode can easily work into its runtime a half a minute plus clip, while an equivalent to that in manga can occupy a page or more, which a chapter lacks the space for. So anime can be more freer with what it includes, while a manga has to be more selective. Overall, with its more open build and extra tools, anime better reuses older sequences. On to the next topic of atmosphere, ambiance, and tone in spiritual or ethereal scenes, where anime more often utilizes visceral or even hallucinogenic moments to communicate what a character experiences. To start off, I want to clarify, I'm not saying manga can't do these types of scenes, they can and have, but the medium of anime more frequently includes them, usually as a means to allow its manga counterpart more time to advance farther on in the story. Which despite that, the scenes themselves rather consistently end up at some of the most memorable or even creative moments across an entire franchise. As a matter of fact, what I generally consider to be my favorite Dragon Ball Z scene falls under this concept, where during the Frieza saga, an exhausted mentally beat Goku heard words of encouragement from the spirit of the recently deceased Vegeta, referring to the battle-worn warrior as the personification of the Saiyans, all while reminding him of their race's pride. And throughout this speech, the spirit took on different forms, and exposed present-day Vegeta facing away from Goku, revealing him to have regrown his previously amputated tail, a child version of himself, as well as him in his great ape state. And this montage concluded with their two dead father's ghosts joining in the cheer. To me, this mystical scene reached a level deeper than any other in the franchise. So deep that it's almost hard to put into words. An unclothed Vegeta meant that he hid nothing and came as his uncorrupted self. His regrown tail supplemented his ghostly nature, all while sending the message that the spirit cannot be dismembered. So because anime gives you scenes like this, is why I without hesitations call it better than the manga. By the way, editions like this occurred in other series too, such as Kinnikuman for example, where in one arc the titular protagonist had to face 7 deadly opponents in a row, and after besting the first 2, the hero found himself too exhausted to physically continue, only for 5 of his friends, all former enemies turned allies, to volunteer to fight on his behalf, pledging that after their matches, they'll meet up again at a certain place and time. Flash forward to that scene, after several of his friends had been left up to fates unknown. Now, at the designated place of meetup, Kinnikuman waited for his pals to arrive, but the hours kept passing by, along with the arranged time, and soon the sun began to set. Again, I repeat, atmosphere synonymous with something ending or dying, thus awakening a lingering fear that his friends hadn't survived. Only for walking in unison silhouettes of his comrades in front of the setting sun to appear, provoking the protagonist to in slow motion tearfully run towards them. But once he neared them, their silhouettes vanished, causing him to believe his fears had come true. I view this as a great scene because it communicated with you through symbolism, rather than directly telling you, while at the same time setting you up for a certain outcome, only to flip the script. With all that said, I'm not implying manga can't feature similar scenes. I can actually see how the medium might adapt these sequences into panel format. But because anime more often adds these types of scenes on a whim, is why I ultimately view it as a superior medium. On that note, I'll mention how manga commonly attempts constructing scenes that peer into matters of the soul, where oftentimes they invert colors to transcend the body. In saying that, I refer to a moment from the Slam Dunk manga, where a prodigal son-esque character finally reunited with the mentor he hadn't seen in years, which in this panel, its illustration, turned this character's normally jet black hair and school uniform white, while also using minimal pinstrokes to add the necessary details. From that, I'll say, the incorporation of this style or technique implies that the sight of his spiritual father touched him at a level deeper than his physical body. Now, the anime equivalent to this scene had said character's face go white, so that everything except his outlines matched the color of the backdrop, which also suggested his reunion penetrated a layer beyond the skin, meaning it sent the same message. What I'm getting at is, if a studio puts in the effort, anime can replicate anything manga can do, whereas I don't see that as true the other way around, or at least in the sense of reaching the same heights as the anime. Like in the scene from Kinnikuman, the brief use of slow motion played just as much a role in establishing the ambiance as the illustration. And with the one from Dragon Ball Z, without movement, it would lose some of its ghostly hallucinogenic aura. Just to clarify everything, I'm not claiming that every anime perfectly captures the essence of its source material, far from it. In fact, I believe some manga artists mastered the aesthetics of black and white imagery to such a high degree that they can be nearly impossible to translate into colored animation. Bleach and the works of Junji Ito come to mind. But if a creative director with a vision controls the project, I believe the opportunity at least exists to rival or even surpass the manga. Whereas again, I can't say the same about the comic, perfectly adapting much less surpassing the works of a master of animation. Since in this past subject I've repeatedly mentioned the use of anime-exclusive moments, otherwise known as filler, I thought now would be a good time to discuss it in full. To start off, I'm going to boldly state that filler benefits anime around 70 to 80% of the time. I just believe it's been given a stigma because perpetually ongoing series like Naruto Shippuden and the latter half of Bleach flagrantly insert it wherever without caring if it disrupted the plot or continuity, and it made no effort to make it entertaining because they knew their fans would still probably stick around afterwards. By the way, I remind everyone that these two franchises along with One Piece classify as some of the few cases of where I rate the manga version over the anime. Also, I should mention that even if these two examples may be some of the most well-known anime, they don't exactly reflect the medium as a whole, as few series air for 10 plus consecutive years, so the average filler won't be like that of Naruto or Bleach. With that rant out of the way, looking at my list of favorite anime, among the ones that fall under the category of adaptations of manga, a surprisingly high number of them have a filler scene ranking as one of their best moments. I've already pointed out ones from Dragon Ball Z and Kinnikuman, but to further solidify my argument, I'll add another example from Yu Yu Hakusho. First off, I don't consider this as the greatest moment across the entire story, but from within its own arc, I personally view it as its best, and it's when the main character, Yusuke Urameshi, took on the Demon King Yomi. Now, in the manga, you can't even call this match a fight, as it basically consisted of Yusuke thinking he couldn't win, then followed up with him throwing a few punches, thus concluding the chapter, and the next one began several days after the match ended. Whereas the anime fleshed this into an actual battle, one of the series' finest, by adding scenes of Yusuke struggling to even phase his opponent, Yomi becoming enraged at the lack of a challenge in a battle he sacrificed everything for, provoking him to pummel the hero into a lucid haze, where the protagonist reflected on his past opponents, contemplating why they fought, and if he had become one of them, only to recognize the voice of a deceased ancestor, a prevalent character of the past arc, which reminded him of what he stood for. Then later on, through spirit, heard the cheers of all the friends he's made up to this point, many of whom currently reside in a different plane of existence, causing Yusuke to uncover, but not fully master, the next step in his evolution as a fighter, and manage to injure the seemingly unbeatable Demon King. Then the battle ended in the same way as the manga. I view this scene as the superior version, not for adding extra action, but because it recalled several integral to the story plot points, and tied them together in a way that it left the impression that everything thus far culminated in this moment. So it felt like everything mattered. In addition to that, the anime's portrayal of the unwinnable battle helped Yusuke to better understand himself, as a running theme of the story involved maturation, and this fight set him on that path by learning to understand what he fought for, whereas in the manga, its version really felt like he didn't gain anything from the experience. Overall, this filler scene better embodied the spirit of the series than its own source material. Just so you can understand everything from my perspective, I'll say this. 3 of my top 4 favorite shonens have a filler scene ranking as one of their best moments. So that's why I don't have this blind hatred for the word. Another recurring positive of filler pertains to how it can break away from monotony. For instance, I know this may sound controversial, but I strongly prefer the original Fullmetal Alchemist anime to its later release filler cutting closer to the manga reboot, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. First off, let me state that in the older series, quite a number of my favorite characters turned out to be filler, so that definitely played a role in shaping my opinion. But besides that, I noticed a separate issue in the faster-paced Brotherhood, which regarded how the base story essentially repeated the same formula over and over again. Just a quick heads up, from here on out this topic will contain spoilers. Summing up a few early narratives, first off, the main characters encountered a seemingly kind miracle man, who turned out to be corrupt. Next, they met a seemingly nice father, who also turned out to be corrupt. And after that, they joined a seemingly good government that turned out to be corrupt. Even non-encounters could be construed as a type of corruption. Like the main characters learned alchemy for a good cause, only for it to backfire against them, i.e. corruption. Now, I understand you could say evil hiding behind a smile embodied an overarching theme of the story, but it occurred so frequently that it made everything seem repetitive and predictable, which Brotherhood's rapid arc contained within an episode pace made all the more apparent. And for that reason is why I consider the filler as an enhancement to the storytelling, as the anime-exclusive plotlines often disrupted this pattern by featuring more positive narratives so that every time a new character came into the fray, you didn't automatically assume them to be harboring some sinister intention. And let's just say when something turned out corrupt, the event itself could still catch you off guard, since not every prior character fell victim to this trope. Overall, the filler of Full Metal Alchemist added variety to the story, thus preventing redundancy, while also serving as a sort of comedic relief, so when the more serious moments took place, their effects amplified and left a greater impact. Lastly, filler can fortify areas that may have been perceived as weak or lacking in the manga. One such case would be with the series of Inuyasha, where a recurring complaint revolved around how the main character possessed numerous interesting techniques that went underutilized, primarily because they required specific conditions to work. Well, through filler, the anime added extra scenarios where they could take place. For instance, one of Inuyasha's moves, the Backlash Wave, reflects energy-based attacks back at their wielder. Now in the manga, most antagonists would classify as defensive-based fighters, so in the canon this technique rarely got utilized. But through filler, the anime included more opponents that could unleash energy blasts, thus letting Inuyasha perform his iconic Backlash Wave more often to satisfy his fans' wishes. Next, the story possessed a love triangle element, where a third wheel tried to get in between the male and female leads. Now, in the manga, after the protagonists shacked up together, this character just faded away with nothing, whereas the anime's filler introduced a female counterpart to him, so after his inevitable rejection, he wouldn't be left out in the cold. By the way, this anime-exclusive love interest debuted rather early on in the overall plot, meaning her inclusion never rubbed off as contrived either. So, in a satisfying manner, the anime's filler tied up a loose end of the manga. While still on this topic, Inuyasha, as well as with the other works of its author Rumiko Takahashi, Urusei Yatsura, Meisana Koku, and Ranma, much of their charm didn't stem from stringently following plot, but more so from the chemistry between its cast. And a lot of times, the filler gave you just that. In fact, quite often you might mistake canon material for filler, or even vice versa. So if you actually enjoy the series, i.e. watching it for more than just another notch under your belt, you'll probably also like the filler as well. To conclude this section, from my perspective, I don't see filler as this big bad demon that tarnishes flawless works, but instead something that usually works in tandem with or even improves upon the original body. Now yes, I fully admit, filler can be bad, just as with canon material, or even mesh horribly with the rest of the story, again, just as with canon material. But I just believe a few bad apples have completely overshadowed the overwhelming amount of contributions it's given to the medium. Up next, I'm continuing on with the idea of how anime can fix mangas, but through correcting inconsistencies. To begin, except under rare circumstances, more often than not, anime adaptations specifically designed to follow their source material as closely as possible start airing well into the lifespan of their counterpart manga, which provides the medium the leeway to dodge issues that can arise during the initial release of a series. For instance, as the production of a manga can span years, certain aspects during the creation process can be subject to change. Character designs, for example. As in the manga of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Stone Ocean, one character debuted as a short-haired female, then ended up on the back burner for a little over 20 chapters, and later returned as a long-haired man. So the appearance itself experienced a significant overhaul between chapters that you'd have to pretend never happened if you read the manga during its initial run. As you can guess, or if you haven't heard by now, in the recent animated adaptation of the series, said character appeared in their finalized design right from the get-go. So the anime corrected this scene, meaning you don't have to turn the blind eye to this continuity-breaking alteration. Now, I specifically cited the case from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, instead of, say, Kinnikuman 7 Devil Chojin exchanging members between chapters, because the Stone Ocean manga couldn't rectify the design change in the final product, since the volume containing the chapter that introduced said character already released before the redesign occurred. What I'm getting at is, manga only possesses a limited amount of time to issue corrections, whereas anime, on the other hand, can wait on adapting a manga, just so everything can come out in its finalized form, so it won't have to break continuity. Another way anime can correct/improve manga involves how if an adaptation begins production after the manga's completion, it can rearrange the structure of the story to flow better. And to that I go to the Cyborg 009 franchise. But first off, let me state that part of this as an improvement argument comes from my own personal preferences rather than from objective facts. To start off, the series manga splits up into 3 segments, Part 1 was supposed to be the original beginning and ending of the story, Part 2 a forced continuation that primarily retained the essence and style of Part 1, and finally Part 3, which consisted of more philosophically driven, loosely structured narrative arcs. Now, Part 1 of the series concluded magnificently by going out with an absolute bang, all while serving as a fitting in for a long-running story, i.e. not just a mid-story arc. But because of that, a continuation would be just plain awkward, especially since it implied characters perished. So when influential people coerced a Part 2, its existence built off a foundation that required a suspension of belief thought process. As the story picked up like nothing had happened and never answered how everyone made it out of Part 1 alive. In saying that though, here's where my perspective comes in, where I say many of the franchise's best moments occurred towards the end of Part 2 and during the run of Part 3, so ignoring everything after Part 1 for continuity's sake means you'll miss out on some of the series' best moments, or even arcs. Now, the 2001 anime adaptation of Cyborg 009 completely remedied this entire situation by moving the conclusion of Part 1 to the very end of the story's timeline, which allowed for the more intriguing moments of the later parts to take place, all while dodging the awkwardness of the transition into Part 2, and still going out with a thrilling conclusion of Part 1. So, since the production of anime adaptations typically begin after or at least well into the life of a manga, it has the luxury to patch up inconsistencies, as it can see the forest for the trees. Now yes, exceptions to this exist. Like you can find cases of anime, especially among those adapting long-running series, accidentally including elements that might break the continuity of the story. But overall, those negatives pale in comparison to the positives from when it works, as they generally create minor issues, while the restructurings usually clean up more significant problems and improve the overall flow of the story. As I realize my claim may rub off as anecdotal or be perceived as a one-off case, I thought I'd provide another example of this from a different series, one in which I previously called the manga better, in One Piece. Again, I have to say, just because I view one version as superior doesn't mean it does everything better 100% of the time. To start off, the events of Chapter 1 of One Piece took place during Episode 4 of the anime, where its alteration changed how the story introduced its main character, Monkey D. Luffy. For instance, in the manga, Luffy first appeared as a young kid, and Chapter 1 told the tale of what inspired him to pursue his goals, concluding with him of age setting off on his journey. Now, the anime began at what would have been Chapter 2, debuting its lead well into the first episode after other important characters already first appeared, by having him burst out of a closed barrel, accidentally knocking out a man in the process. Now, the adaptation moved back the events of Chapter 1 to Episode 4, by turning it into a flashback sequence. I view the anime introduction, which also took place in the manga, as the superior version, because the purpose of this scene intended to catch you off guard, and when this action happened, it completely deviated from everything established thus far, all the while supplemented by the fact that you the viewer have no idea of who this character may be. So this difference magnified the effects of this scene. Whereas by this point of the manga, you've already seen a grown-up Luffy, and semi-understand his idiosyncrasies, so it doesn't carry as great a surprise, therefore impact. Not to mention that busting out of a barrel simply comes off as a more dynamic entrance than just beginning this story as a kid. Also, let me say that even in the manga, this moment feels like an introductory scene, so the concept itself comes off as redoing the same thing twice without adding anything new. Plus, I should mention that the anime's introduction of Luffy better established the spirit of the story. Like, One Piece presents itself as a continuous journey, rather than as bullet points across a timeline. Basically, at a narrative level, it followed the protagonist through his adventures, instead of constantly skipping ahead to only the important stuff. So starting off in the present era, and revealing his past through a flashback, better maintained the flow of the story. Now, even though this restructuring may not be as drastic as Cyborg 009's, or even have really affected its overall plot, I still think it improved upon the series' presentation, which highlights how sometimes anime surpasses its source material. For technicality's sake, I will say not all anime restructurings work or pay off. I even admit a few later cases from One Piece spoiled a few characters' canonical intros. It's just that I see this as a manner in how sometimes anime improves upon its manga. Moving on to the next subject, I have to say, for this video, I've been straying away from the low-hanging fruits of this debate. Arguments like how anime-exclusive traits such as music, animation, voice acting, and coloring establish it as a superior medium, and when I ventured near that territory, I tried my best to extrapolate something deeper from those qualities than just the base points, like how certain colors evoke the tone, atmosphere, or mood, or how utilizing multiple voices at one time induces an overwhelmed state that inserts you into the mindset of the character. But in saying that, I feel a compulsion to mention the unsung hero of the anime production, or just motion pictures in general: editing. To start off, one might rationalize paneling or the framing of a manga page as a sort of editing, which does carry some truth, but since the medium rests upon a page, it has nowhere near the amount of freedom, as it lacks the space and requires relativity or a connecting factor between images. For instance, anime can easily fit into an episode a quarter-second clip or picture without disrupting anything, whereas in manga, including something like that presents a challenge, as it can throw off the pacing, like a reader may interpret it as a normal-length regular panel, when it's more supposed to play a quick aesthetic purpose. Like the insertion of a brief memory or an intimidating skull during the montage of an anime attack, the medium clearly portrays how and where it fits into the story, whereas its use in manga can feel unrelated to the prior images, so its intentions can be a bit unclear. Not to mention, its inclusion potentially takes away space from a more significant scene. Now, sometimes manga implies the importance of a panel through either increasing or decreasing its size in comparison to the other illustrations. But again, if drawn too small, it looks weird next to everything else, and begs the question, why even include it? Meaning these minor additions that enhance anime often don't have a home in manga. So overall, anime has more flexibility with what it can include, and because of that, it can add these seemingly minor moments that totally enhance the scene. Next, as a medium, anime can get away with certain elements that simply won't fly in manga. For instance, animation requires only one on-screen image at a time, so reusing old ones won't be as noticeable or lessen the immersion. Whereas in manga, as several illustrations rest on a single page, if an artist attempts this practice, it becomes fairly evident, as the same drawing could appear next to itself. And because of that, this will make said series imagery seem lazy or weak. Plus, I should also mention that anime can better disguise this when it occurs, because it can add little animations such as hand gestures or lip flaps to create the illusion that this old image is new. With these two ideas stated, leads me to why I say anime handles conversations better than manga, because it can seamlessly cut back and forth between people exchanging words without creating any conflicts. Whereas during the dialogue of manga, I quite often find that they either resort to using minimal amounts of text-based lines, just to avoid the necessity of needing additional drawings of characters conversing, which can frequently leave some aspects feeling underexplained. Or I often see one panel absolutely cluttered in text bubbles that can make it a pain to read and follow. So again, the editing/format of anime better deals with characters speaking to each other, which often coincides with providing more comprehensive explanations. Diving deeper into the editing versus paneling argument, because anime can place a set amount of time per image, that allows it to tell a brief story in and of itself through montages. Like a few 5-second establishing shots will tack on little to no extra weight onto a 23-minute episode of anime, as opposed to a page of manga, where a panel equivalent to those establishing shots could take up a full page, which would bear down heavily on a 15-page chapter. So for that reason, anime can include more of these relatively minor sequences that still greatly flesh out the environment or an unfolding scene. In addition to that, during moments like these, because of underlying factors such as music, audio, or consistent screen size, when anime displays seemingly unrelated to the occurring story's imagery, it won't feel out of place, since something other than appearance binds it together. Whereas if a manga suddenly shows an out-there panel, it will likely come off as out of place and break immersion. With all that said, I want to exhibit a few legendary editing sequences from the medium of anime, and highlight how they can't translate to manga, or at least would lose their essences in the process. To begin, the infamous congratulations scene from Neon Genesis Evangelion, where in a dreamlike montage, almost all the major cast members of the story, each separately with their heads positioned right in front of the view, all while clapping, told the protagonist, "Congratulations." Now, I don't see how the format of manga can replicate this scene and still retain its effects. Like as a medium, it lacks the page space to allow 15 to 20 consecutive panels of faces saying congratulations in a row. Like if it combined them all into groups of 5, it would feel impersonal, which would also take away from the one featured set of paired characters, the protagonist's own parents, who had long since separated from each other, thus representing them reuniting. Or if the panels shrunk down everyone's portraits to fit onto one page or two, it would come across as mechanical and lose its warmth. To prove my overall point, the series of Akame ga Kill implemented a similar idea into one of its sequences, where its hero, during an intense struggle, envisioned his teammates. Now, the animated version of this scene displayed each member separately, like Neon Genesis had done so earlier, while its later release manga lumps them all together as a group into one single panel, both of which variations caused differing effects. One that fondly remembered everyone as an individual, semi-exhibiting their own quirks, while the other portrayed them more as a unit. So, since for this similar scene the paneling of the Akame ga Kill manga couldn't capture the spirit of its anime, most likely this would also apply to the congratulations sequence of Neon Genesis as well. The next case of where the format of manga couldn't replicate the effects of editing, or at least without diluting it, would be the opening sequence of Bubblegum Crisis, which within a single montage intertwined two different simultaneously unfolding events. by consistently jumping back and forth between both narratives to show how thematically they reflected each other and hint at how some characters might conjoin these two situations together. This sequence, accompanied by the beat of a guitar, began with an establishing shot of a nightclub. Then the scene moved inside to a view of a woman sensually applying makeup to herself, and cut to a perspective that panned across an audience, specifically emphasizing one man sitting in front of an empty stage. Then, the montage cut back and forth between the woman dolling herself up, the crowd, and people preparing the stage for a concert. And once fully dressed, the scene revealed the woman to be the lead singer of the band set to perform. And once on stage, her vocals joined in the still ongoing guitar track. Soon into the performance, the emphasized audience member received a phone call, provoking him to exit the building. Then the montage started to cut between the perspectives of the band performing and futuristic police officers, of which a man who just left the audience belonged to, fighting off a killer robot destroying a city. Midway into this sequence, a segment merged these two narratives together by having the backdrop of the concert shift from that of the stage to one that projected the image of driving through the winding roads of the city. On to why adapting a manga version of this montage would pose a challenge. First off, many of these individual segments within this sequence last only a few seconds, and they consist of more content than just different perspectives of the same scene. Like at certain points of this sequence, 20 seconds of this 4+ minute montage would probably take up an entire page of manga, so adapting these segments into panels would easily occupy too much room for a manga to maintain the illusion that this all ties into a concert. Now, let's just say the manga found extra space, or even removed a few scenes, which may remedy this issue, but it wouldn't correct and would probably exacerbate the next even more significant problem, pertaining to the fact that if this got put to page, the structuring would feel chaotic, disjointed, and unorganized because of all the back and forth cutting between multiple events. So, establishing a scene-by-scene relativity would prove difficult. The anime, through the accompanying music and to a lesser extent camera work, pacing, and coloring, linked all these situations together in a coherent montage. But without those factors, this would seem like a smattering of random images rather than a sequence. Lastly, this sequence harnessed several editing techniques that would not look as good in manga format. Like on several occasions, this montage used multiple in-motion layers of the singer dancing to the music, not to mention the many fade-in, fade-outs to cut away from segments. Plus, the onstage lighting of this performance alternates between multiple colors within a single scene, which is a totally immersive element that could not be contained in an uncolored manga, let alone a single image per panel comic. Now, I do think manga could semi-replicate a few of these edits. One manner involves how some illustrations feature a character that reaches out of their panel's boundaries and into another, but even then, it would occur so consistently that it would become redundant/invasive. And plus, even though it may overlap drawings, it doesn't exactly tie them together in the same way, so it would still lose the intertwining two narratives aspect, which if lost, would beat the entire purpose of having this montage. Overall, editing in its own right serves as a type of storytelling, as the transitioning to new images or scenes, or through how it orders everything, creates its own unique effect that influences how one interprets a story. While discussing editing, I'll cover a subject adjacent to it in pacing. Now, one of the most cited reasons for why some prefer manga over anime involves the phrase, "you can read it at your own pace." Basically, anime, or any video-based media for that matter, except through speed manipulation, consists of a set amount of time, i.e., something timed in at 20 minutes always goes for 20 minutes. While with manga, something intended for a 10-minute reading session can be consumed in 5 if the reader so desires, meaning it possesses more flexible scheduling. Now, when I hear this rationale referenced, I commonly find it linked to the impression that anime solely stretches out scenes to allow ample breathing room between its current episode and the most recently released chapter of the manga, and not for the fact that it may fulfill an artistic purpose, or on an emotional level, yield a more immersive effect. For instance, the ill-received elevator scene of Neon Genesis featured two characters bitter towards each other for a whole straight minute, sharing an awkward silent ride on an elevator together, which embodied the tension in their relationship. And for you as a viewer, this moment intended to make you feel uncomfortable, which if you have the attention span, it will. So the prolonged length of this scene actually has a reason to drag on, and I have to say, if it lacked that set amount of time, i.e. reduced to a few manga panels, it would lose that intended impact. The next advantage of an extended scene lies in the fact that the effects of an image can evolve or take on new forms over time. Like at first glance, a funny face may appear as goofy, but if left to linger, it may start to give off a creepy vibe. And even if a sequence specifically includes additional panels to rectify this aspect is something that I think can easily get glossed over in a manga, since the medium possesses an at-your-own-pace mentality instead of a directorially determined runtime. So compared to anime, the overall structuring of manga opens up more room for misinterpretations. In addition to that, in some cases the lengthening of scenes can amplify their effects. An indecisive scenario, for instance. Like, let's just say a character finds themselves hesitating before a great choice, and not knowing what to do. Well, the insertion of a brief pause can increase the drama, bolster the internal struggle, and make you, the audience, feel as if you experienced the unfolding situation in real time. For reference, the panels of manga possess an isolated moment within a greater scene vibe, instead of a second-per-second ratio of reality to anime. In essence, temporally, manga exists on its own wavelength separate from you, the viewer. So you can't experience it in real time as you can with anime. On that note, the same idea applies to power-up sequences, where prolonging the transformation itself can build up suspense and justify the believability of its might. For instance, in the Dragon Ball manga, Goku's unlocking of the Super Saiyan form consisted of only 3 panels. 4 if you count him proclaiming his anger at Frieza, whereas the Dragon Ball Z anime, by including additional content, quite literally turns into a world-shattering event. Like, as the transformation began, lightning started to form and strike the planet, implying that this new power disrupted nature itself. And with Goku, the scene added moments of his veins bulging, him twitching, and his hair flickering gold, all of which sent a message that he struggled to push out something bigger than himself, meaning that when this new form finally came out, it meant something super occurred. So these extra inclusions gave value to this transformation, by turning it into something beyond just a simple 3-picture power-up. Overall, when I see an anime slowing down the pace of a manga, I generally don't view it as dragging on the story, but as giving you the proper time to fully appreciate it for all it's worth. Lastly, before I conclude this video, I wish to state some of the more practical reasons of why I prefer anime, i.e. not their actual content, but their real-world application. First off, I view anime as a more freeing medium. For instance, with manga, you have to focus solely on it, whereas with anime, especially if it has a dub in a language you understand, you can have it on in the background. Like, for me personally, when I'm editing a video about a particular series, if it has a dub or even just iconic music that I associate with the franchise, I often like to have an episode playing while I'm working, as it keeps the topic fresh in my mind, prevents me from thinking about other subjects, and has on several occasions sparked a new idea to include in the video. Now, quite often I've heard people refer to manga as the freer medium, primarily because of that your own pace argument, but I've always disagreed with that perspective, as it really only takes into account one issue. For example, screen-wise, as anime basically plays itself, you don't have to be as up close and personal to consume the medium. Like, I often watch an episode while on an exercise bike, and I only have to get off once the credits roll to click next episode. Whereas with manga, I pretty much have to sit in front of a computer screen the entire time because of how constantly I have to scroll down, wait a few seconds, then click next page, which of course occurs at far more frequent intervals than an episode of anime. So for me personally, I've always associated reading manga with the sensation of feeling chained to a computer. With that said, I know some people will be screaming, it won't be an issue if you just buy the tangible volumes, which I will get to in a minute. But first, let me interject that across both anime and manga, with a lot of what I'm into, you can't exactly buy a physical copy outside of Japan, much less a translated version, meaning you pretty much need the internet to see them. So that statement may be true for newer or more popular series, but not across the board. Now, in terms of hard copy volumes, many have called them freer because of accessibility. Like, I've heard of people reading them while pacing up and down a hallway, during a car ride, and some of them have admitted they fancy a chapter while in the toilet. In the past, that would have been an advantage for manga, but through the rise of digital streaming and devices like smartphones and tablets, anime lives no longer bound to TV screens, and possesses the same anywhere flexibility as manga. The only real exception to this would be that manga doesn't require electricity, but other than that, they're roughly equal now. Another practical reason for why I prefer anime involves the fact that psychologically, I correlate manga to filing your paperwork more than as actual entertainment. One of the rationales for why I perceive the medium as such regards how its format presents itself in a manner that makes its how much is left aspect more noticeable. Like with a physical copy, you literally see hundreds of pages left, which from my perspective, turns this experience into a mountainous undertaking rather than a story I want to read. Whereas the presentation of anime, on the other hand, better disguises this aspect. Now, I know some people might conflate the minutes of an anime to the pages of a manga, which does carry similarities, but even then, anime still better covers it up. Like on most streaming sites, the remaining minutes bar of a video generally disappears after a moment of inactivity, whereas the remaining pages of a tangible volume can't be hidden. Even through digital releases, this still holds true. Again, I remind everyone that anime basically plays itself. So for me, I almost don't even pay attention to the remaining minutes or episodes left prompts. Whereas since I more actively participate in the viewing sessions of manga, scrolling and clicking next page every minute or so, I'm more aware of the how much is left element. Overall, I view manga as more overwhelming than anime, which is why I prefer the latter. Next, why I find viewing anime is less complicated than reading manga. For the record, in this topic, I'm only comparing these mediums on digital platforms. First off, the presentation of anime automatically conforms to the contours of any screen, regardless of the device. So because of its consistent size and shape, it can be readily viewed at the click of a button. Whereas since illustrators specifically designed manga for a book/page format, it doesn't exactly complement showings on screens. Like, to fit a full page of manga on a screen generally means zooming so far out that it becomes barely legible, and with the reverse of zooming in, that often results in constantly having to scroll up and down the page. Admittedly, these don't amount to all that great an issue in the end, but they do make me perceive anime as a more seamless medium. While still on the subject of screens, I have to say I find anime less straining on the eyes than manga, which I believe stems from the color white amplifying the brightness of a screen, and the typically uncolored latter maximizes this issue to its fullest effect. What supplements this all the more regards how manga requires a more up-close and personal viewing from the consumer, since it relies heavily on small text, involves scrolling up and down a page, i.e. more input, and all around has difficulty conforming to the size of a screen. So again, the colorized, watchable at a distance format of anime places less strain on the eyes, therefore I view it as the preferable experience. All these practical reasons for why I prefer anime culminate in a new one as well, which admittedly most others may not find pertinent to themselves, revolving around how the medium presents itself in a much more consumable fashion. Now, I as a person like to explore series and genres that I know I'll likely hate, just to know what they are, because I hold the mentality that to fully understand a subject, you have to venture into territories that you may not enjoy. Like, if you appreciate anime for anime's sake, rather than just as a form of entertainment, you can't ignore the fact that stuff outside of your comfort zone influenced and helped shape the medium into what it is. I mean, the magical girl genre somehow inspired the hypermasculine Berserk. Tying this back to the main idea, you can casually watch an anime and still gain something, whereas manga requires much more of an investment to consume, and if you don't put in the effort, you won't acquire all that much from it. For example, animation flat out tells you what occurs, while with manga, because of its isolated moment-in-time panels, you have to connect the dots a la sequence of events together yourself. Even this, if an anime has a dub, you don't have to focus solely on it and can briefly look away while still getting the gist/idea of it. Whereas manga won't read itself to you, so as an experience it only moves forward if you push it forward. In summation, I prefer anime because it easier allows me to sample areas that I wish to learn about, but not fully submerse myself in. To conclude this video, I have to admit, I wrote it with an ulterior motive, as lately I've observed many manga fans devolving the anime versus manga debate into the book is better than the movie argument, i.e. basically a subtle way to say, I'm more intelligent/a better fan because I venture down the road less traveled. So I just wanted to present some counterpoints to theirs, to highlight the nuances of this debate, while also displaying how both mediums possess their own strengths and weaknesses. At the same time, I acknowledge validity in some of the claims of manga beating out anime. And in all honesty, I see them becoming more and more true in the years to come, as lately I've noticed an uptick of bad censorship, the kind that dilutes the spirit of a series, or many newer adaptations rushing through their sources' stories so fast that it leaves little to no time for the audience to even resonate with it. And I have to say, I see many recent anime sticking too close to their mangas, so much so that they fail to establish their own intrinsic identity, reducing themselves to just a lesser version of the manga. So strictly speaking, comparing today's anime and manga, I believe it fair to call the latter better. Putting it bluntly, I'm not pretending that the anime industry has the brightest of futures, or even that it currently retains the essence of what built it up. But I uphold that its past, what made me a fan of the medium in the first place, laid out a strong foundation that will always carry a permanence, and transcend the anime versus manga debate. So, that's why I prefer anime over manga. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you all found it informative. If you have any points to add or even disagree with any of my own, feel free to comment below. Again, thanks for watching.